Hello students. Today we are going to discuss about rise of English, which is a part of the syllabus from 4th semester English major. So rise of English, it is associated with the 19th century England and the Victorian life. But before going into this aspect, we have to make a search about the background, that what is exactly the concept of English before us. So as you know, that historically English, it was a language which was there in the English islands, that came with the Germanic tribes like the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and who brought a low German language. And after the advent of the Normans in 1066, the influence of the French, which came through the Normans, influenced this English, which was termed by the historians as the Old English. So by the blend of this French brought by the Normans, it became the Middle English. And during this period, actually the English society was divided between the French-speaking Normans and the English-speaking Saxons. But after 12th century, there seems to be a growing assimilation between the two, and during the reign of Edward II and III, we find that there is a proper assimilation between the two, and by 14th century, England was having this new English, which we know now as the Middle English period. And the Middle English actually did away with the noun declensions and the inflections of the verbs. Actually, they have reduced largely these two aspects of Old English language. And again by 14th century, we can find that English language is getting standardized, and in the hands of Chaucer, as we know, he is rightfully called as the father of English language and literature. And thereafter we find in the period of Elizabeth or the period of Renaissance that English literature flourished, and English language got further standardized through the translations of the Bible by bringing some archaic elements into English language. And in this period, in spite of the flourish of English literature, we find that English language and literature are not being the part of the educational curriculum in most of the educational institutions of England. Though from the 12th century, the universities have already come into existence, but these universities were mainly catering to the classical language and literature of Latin and Greek. So again, we find that the English people who, after the assimilation between the Normans and the Saxons, were trying to realize a concept of nationalism, English nationalism, were not in favor of bringing English language and literature into the education in a proper way. The English nationalism, the English sentiment, which grew particularly after the Renaissance, it also didn't help much in furthering the interest of English studies. In spite of the maritime supremacy of England during Renaissance, in spite of establishing lot many colonies across the world, in spite of bringing great number of translations from the classical literature and making English literature at par with the other contemporary European literature, they have somewhere didn't feel the necessity of bringing English literature studies into the higher education. But in 19th century, the Victorian period, the necessity was acutely felt by the Victorian elite because particularly of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution or the advancement of science during this period had a very pronounced effect on the English life. Particularly the assuredness of religiousness was declining. So people going for Latin or Greek studies had a declining trend. Similarly, during the Victorian period, the establishment of colonies all over the world, as well as the consolidation of these colonies, making England one of the superpowers of the world, made the English people take their own pride in their nationalistic identity. And 19th century being one of the turning point in nationalism of Europe, also made English people realize that their nationalistic identity, their national pride can only be achieved through a proper English studies. And during this period also, the other elements that helped in spreading of English studies or bringing a consciousness about English studies were like the widespread literacy, adult education, and an emphasis on English culture. Specifically, Matthew Arnold, the champion of culture of Victorian England, he emphasized that the English middle class or the English intellectuals, they must get a traditional tag, and this traditional tag can only be got through championing their own language and literature. So during the Victorian period, we found that there were a penchant for bringing English language and literature into the studies, into the curriculum in a very broad manner. So we can divide this, or we can classify this tendency into two groups. One is to introduce English studies for making it an agency of consolidation, not among the English islands, but also the English people who are living in different parts. And the second objective of this introduction of the studies was to bring political subjugation of the colonies. As we see in this period, in contrary to the French colonization, which aimed at assimilating the colonies with its mainland, the British colonialism emphasized on creating a sense of otherness in the colonies by teaching them English and creating a sense of superiority by not imparting them their culture but condemning the native culture as inferior. So here we find that the purpose behind rise of English in Victorian period was not singular. There were several other ideas also. And the other ideas, we can say that the concept of social Darwinism and the white man's burden, which were carried out by the colonial mind, the colonial missionaries who went to spread their religion in the colonies, they had taken the pretext of white man's burden, the burden of civilizing the colonies, and through that imposing on them the English teaching, the teaching of English language and literature, to colonize their mind and systematically to decimate the native literature, the native culture and the native language. On the other hand, this period also wanted to impart English studies to their own children for two purposes. One purpose being introduction of these studies in the mechanic institutes which came up in large numbers all over the England, particularly in the middle part of 19th century. And the purpose of the English scholars was to bring a sense of humanism or a human aspect in these studies of industry, of mechanism, by imparting literature. And by imparting the literature studies, they wanted to make these people sensible to their own culture, to build a culture of their own. And in another aspect, English studies was also imparted to those students who were studying in the institutions of higher education to make them eligible candidates for the rulers of the colonies, to bring within them a sense of superiority, a sense of the colonial mastery. And beside these two aspects of introducing English studies in native England, we can also find a third dimension there. That was English studies was a purpose of creating a sense of tradition in English people, because England was lacking in tradition. Therefore, England was having the classical literature and language as the most valuable academic courses in their universities. But now, during this Victorian period, when England became most prosperous, most powerful, and dominating the whole world, now they wanted to create a tradition for their own. So English studies can only create that tradition in the mind of the students for the future generation. So in this way, 19th century or the Victorian mind was adapting to the new English studies with so many different purposes. And what we found, that from the middle part of 19th century, and to be exact from 1860s, in 1860 English studies was introduced in the University of Oxford and subsequently in the University of Cambridge. And English studies tried to replace the studies of the classical language and literature in those universities. And in the beginning of 20th century, particularly after the World War, England was in process of trying to bring back its supremacy in the world theatre, and particularly it wanted to compete with the advancement of knowledge that was visible in Germany, in United States of America, in France. So the English government entrusted the responsibility of suggesting the educational reform, and a committee was formed in 1919, and the chairman of this committee was Sir Henry John Newbolt. He was a novelist, a historian, a poet, and also an advisor to the government. In 1921, the Newbolt report was submitted. It was a very lengthy report suggesting many ideas for bringing reformation into higher studies or the educational policy of England. But among that, two important suggestions stood out. Number one, need for wide recognition of the value of liberal education of English as the only literature to provide it as classical tradition fails to do justice to English. So, English studies must be introduced as a liberal studies. Means it has to be all pervading, and it has to take all aspects of studies, because it has to replace the traditional classical studies which fails to do justice to the English mind. So English has to be replaced. English has to replace the study of classical language and literature. Number two, English language and literature studies can provide a beginning of a universal, reasonable and liberal process of development. And this committee also very strongly suggested that English language and literature studies must be introduced in such a manner that it has to begin a universal, reasonable and liberal process of development. Means the development of English mind. That there should be suitable for ruling all over the world, as well as grasping the global culture in such a manner that they can establish their superiority. So in this way, what happened? The New World Report was presented, it was accepted, and it was implemented. And when it was implemented, again we find that it is in the mechanic schools or the mechanic institutes, they started with the introduction of the study of English literary history. And what was the argument of introducing English literary history? The argument was that the study of English literary history can inculcate a sense of pride in the culture and literature of their own country. So, the study of English literature will inculcate a sense of pride in their own culture and literature. And secondly, to imbibe the idea of an English tradition, to imbibe an idea of English tradition through this history of English literature. So, we find that the cultural, social, and literary ambition of the Victorian England was renewed and reinvigorated by the New World Report. And English studies became universal. It was introduced in all the institutes of higher education along with the history of English literature. And then we find that in 20th century, other dimensions also came into this study of English literature. And we find that the concept of Arnold, that literature is the panacea for all social ills, that has been making progress in 20th century, but in a different manner. Particularly if we talk about the Lewis, F.R. Lewis and his wife Q.D. Lewis, they had contributed a lot to the rise of English in 20th century. Particularly F.R. Lewis, he also re-emphasized that education is closely related to the cultural conditions, and only a proper program and method could serve the interest of the English people. And he wanted to bring a particular development in English academic discipline. So, what sort of changes he brought? He brought the changes in the concept of inclusiveness, because Victorian English studies was exclusive. It was excluding the other, even within England, because England was having different provinces, and the different provinces were having different English speaking people, having their different accents, having their different cultural heritage, their conditionings. So, the English that was properly taken by the Victorian England, that was the English of London, what we know as the East Midland speech, which was way back in 14th century, was accepted as the received standard English. So that was exclusive. But F.R. Lewis suggested that English studies must be highly inclusive. It should include the minorities, their culture, their literature. They should also be included within the English studies. So in this way, there is a difference between the 19th century English studies and the 20th century English studies. And Lewis also wanted to show a path of critical inquiry that would uphold the ethical structures upon which society was supposed to stand. So he also emphasized on the ethical structure within the English studies. And he wanted to associate the minority culture within the English studies. And in this way, what we found that even in 20th century, when I.A. Richards came forward and proposed that English studies should be of mass education, it should not discriminate, but it should be for mass education, and it should percolate into the different parts of the society. In this manner, what we find that 20th century English studies became a major area of scholarship. But towards the last part of 20th century, when we find that different colonies under England gradually got independent, and now they were within the English studies, but gradually they have realized that their own culture, their own literature, their own traditions, they are very much rich and prosperous, and somewhere even comparatively richer than that of the English. Therefore, the writers in these colonies, they also found English as a suitable medium to express their own feelings, their own literature. So English literature in the latter part of the 20th century became more enriched by these writings from different parts of the earlier colonies. So the post-colonial literature, the post-colonial English studies also questioned the veracity of study of English literary history. And this questioning led to a later development where the different parts of the world, in Africa, in China, in India, in Australia, in Canada, people coming out to protest against the imposition of study of history of English literature and to bring their own culture into English studies. So English studies became really a post-colonial study in the latter part of 20th century, where the colonies wrote back through the English studies, and English studies became more pluralistic. And recently we see that English studies has become different in different parts of the world, accommodating the culture, the tradition, the history of different colonies which are now independent. So in this way, the rise of English, the English language and literature has become global. It has become enriched, it has become pluralized in spite of losing its importance. And in this context, I can say that in the beginning of the 21st century, even Prince Charles once said that English is losing its importance in England. That means that concept of the inclusive English, that is also working in England. Different provinces of England, they are bringing their own culture, minority culture, their own tradition into the English studies. And I will end my class with one anecdote, one reference, that is to the autobiography of Winston Churchill. So once he told that he wanted to flog those students who went for studying the classical literature and language instead of studying English. And those people, those students who were not bright, they were only being given to study English language and literature in the schools and the universities. But he wanted to make everyone aware about their own language and literature so that they can feel proud about their own nation. And ultimately he became a great prime minister, and that is history. So that is the reason that made the 19th century and 20th century movement for bringing English studies into higher education. I have taken help of these books, though I have taken most of my ideas from the English Social and Cultural History by Dr. Bibhas Chaudhary, but I have also taken the help of History of English Literature by Edward Albert, Literary History of England, edited by A.C. Bow, A History of English Language by A.C. Bow and Thomas Cable, English Social History by G.M. Trevelyan, The English Language by C.L. Wren, and The Social History of England by Padmaja Ashok.